Well, thank you, Richard, for that fulsome introduction. Can I say good morning to everybody, and thank you for being here. I was delighted, I have to say, to be invited to come to New Zealand. I lived in Australia for 5 years, and I never got to New Zealand during that time, and I always felt a sense of guilt and a kind of stupidity that I never made it. So I'm thrilled to be here, and especially, of course, to be in Wellington, which, as we now know, is the 4th best city in the world. I hope that I can stimulate some of the discussion over the next 2 days amongst what's clearly a very young and lively audience, and it's really exciting, I think, to see that. Richard has already talked about the sponsors, but it is very kind of them to fund this particular trip. The one thing I should say, I'm not getting up at 6:30 tomorrow to go for a run. I cannot imagine anything more horrifying. Anyway, I've been asked to speak to the question, what is value in research terms, concentrating especially on the arts and humanities and the social sciences. But don't worry, for the scientists amongst you, I'll stray into science at various points. As Vice-Chancellor of a British research-intensive university, it's a question which, in a sense, inevitably informs what I do generally and in my everyday life. And in abstract terms, what concerns me, both as an academic and as a manager of a university, is how we decide to value the public good that we call research, what exactly is valuable about that research, and how, I suppose, we can add even more value to it. In practical terms, I'm concerned with the increasing pressure there is on both public and private sources of research funding, the heightened competition for such funding in the UK. We're getting dangerously close in grant funding rounds in some research councils to 10% success rates. And I think everyone agrees that that's a very dangerous place to be. And then there are the resultant strictures that are appearing on how research funding is awarded and what kind of research is actually privileged. Now, in UK higher education circles, these kinds of questions were crystallised earlier this year in the debates around what's come to be known as the impact agenda, which came about as a result of the proposed new research excellence framework, the REF, which is a successor to the research assessment exercise, the RAE, and whose purpose is basically to distribute public research funding. And the idea was basically to assess the impact of all research submitted to this exercise on society. This was greeted with a mixture of joy and horror, depending on who you were, I suppose. Joy if you were an engineer, horror if you were working on Bulgarian manuscripts or something of that kind. Interestingly, Warwick took part in the impact pilot exercise. It made 2 submissions, one to physics and one to clinical sciences. And we've subsequently been asked if one example of impact from the physics department, a floating low-ion energy gun, or FLIG as it's called, could be used by the funding council as an example precisely of good practice in terms of impact. And of course, as you won't be surprised to hear, the discussion of impact has promoted much discussion in the UK HE sector and considerable paranoia, it has to be said. Decisions at the moment about whether it will go ahead and in what form are being delayed by the ongoing uncertainty and speculation surrounding the whole future of higher education in the UK. And of course, the large public sector cuts going on are much more of a threat to research in all its many ways than anything to do with impact ever would be. But there is a strange piece of good news from these impact pilots, and that is that impact wasn't half as scary as we thought it would be, and that actually most researchers could demonstrate quite serious impact of the research that they had. Much more, I think, than most of us had ever realised. And in some senses, the sector was being far too modest. Now, we all know that academics suffer chronically from modesty, But having said that, it is quite the case that perhaps we should be a little prouder of actually what we do and a little less defensive about it. I'll come back to that particular point. Now, I know that a kind of variant of this impact agenda is a feature of the research landscape here in New Zealand as well, with the Crown Research Institutes in particular becoming more closely linked with industry and business, and with a new government agenda that requires a greater degree of accountability for the impact and outcomes of work. I gather also that initiatives such as the Performance-Based Research Fund are likely to become more important and that they're likely to include some degree of impact in what they're doing. Whatever happens, though, overshadowing all these issues about what impact research has is the cloud of economic uncertainty around the world. Certainly in many circles, research in higher education and other institutions is being touted as a potential fixer to current global economic woes. But as the title of a recent OECD conference makes clear, the title was Higher Education in a World Changed Utterly, Doing More with Less, always ominous. When politicians start saying that, be very worried. Governments aren't keen on spending much more on research than they are already, even when, and it's a part of, and I can't put this too strongly, a major part of, in many cases, national survival. And I'm going to come back to that point right at the end of the talk by talking about what's going on in the US, and if they're saying the things they are, really there are places around the world, of which the UK is one, which really do need to get their act together, but fast. So, changes in the government funding of the higher education sector in the UK are likely to push us towards a complete realignment of our universities, with many question marks, of course, hanging over the sector's status in the future. Not least, for example, there's going to be no core government funding for teaching for arts and humanities or social sciences. So it's certainly an interesting moment, and I think whether one likes it or not does show a kind of implicit valuation already. And what's clear is that at the same time, British universities at least are going to have to think very seriously about what kind of institutions they are. For example, my own institution, the University of Warwick, in recent years has received about 23% of its funding from the government as core grant. And that's set to fall to about 10 or 15%. So the idea that Warwick is in the public sector is clearly not accurate anymore. As I've been telling people in the university, for all intents and purposes now, we have to think of ourselves as a kind of private sector institution, and you have to make that mindset change. Neither, of course, at the same time are we ever aiming to be a for-profit operation, but we're moving, I suspect, towards an American model of private ownership, not-for-profit. And that's going to be very interesting because, right again, it emphasizes how important research value will be and how one needs to think about it in this kind of changing context. So let me go on then to talk a little bit about economic liberalization and research. Because quite clearly, it is the case that governments now think of research as being about boosting the economy for much of the time. Of course, they talk about all the other things it does, but that's what they're really interested in. And if governments aren't interested in that, the Treasury certainly is, and in most countries, in one variant or another, it's the Treasury what runs things. So, the impact agenda in the UK very quickly and not surprisingly, became interpreted as a push from the government to link economic productivity with research funding. And the headline news was essentially that the type of research that would be funded in the future would be that which had a clear contribution to GDP, to the bottom line. However, in fact, interestingly, the detail shows that they are willing to think of impact much more broadly than that, as affecting society, culture, public policy and services, health, the environment, international development and quality of life. And of course, we can't know what the impact element of the research excellence framework will be. It simply is not known. At one point, they were talking about 25% of the assessment actually being based around this kind of impact. I think that will now go down, but that was, it has to be said, a very interesting moment because we were simply on unknown ground at that point. But what I want to do instead of simply talking about this is explore a more general issue, which is the idea that valuable research is indeed that which is measurable, quantifiable, and demonstrable against contribution towards GDP. And of course, there are lots of difficulties with this assumption, and those have been pointed out many times before. For example, economic benefits might not become clear until a long time after the research has been done. And there are so many examples of that in science. You know that you can just reel off of one form or another, that it's hardly worth bothering to make that point again. Another is that some research, while having clear economic value, is very difficult to directly sheet home to specific economic benefits. It may make an indirect contribution, or it may make a small contribution in combination with a number of other pieces of research. Curiosity-driven research can often result in impact which was unexpected and unpredictable at the start of the research, exactly as you'd expect. Those of you who do research know that what you start out thinking you're going to do isn't necessarily what you actually end up doing, and a good thing too. More fundamentally, and this is central to the argument I want to make, truly valuable research encompasses much more than economic value. If we think about what we appreciate or value in our societies or how we live, one might think that this is an obvious point, but perhaps not. What I want to do is bravely, I think, and probably foolishly, at this point turn to a little bit of social theory. And I hope the scientists in the audience will forgive this excursion. You can snooze for 5 minutes or so, I promise. It won't be any longer than that. And what I want to talk about are Michel Foucault's ideas about governmentality, because I think they are useful in this regard. And the reason is because Foucault, in one of his books, The Birth of Biopolitics, made a very rare excursion into the contemporary world, as it was for him, the 1970s. And the things he had to say about the arts of government and the economy were actually extremely interesting and do apply, I think, to the whole question of what is value. According to Foucault, the art of government in the modern world is really characterized by a series of overlapping governmental rationalities of all sorts. They overlap, as he said, they lean on each other, they challenge each other, and they struggle with each other. And then something comes out of that in the political wash. These rationalities, that of truth, of the sovereign state, as well as the rationality of the governed themselves, compete with each other to form the art of government. And of course, there's a constant balancing act that politicians have to make between these different rationalities. But the rationality that Foucault becomes more interested in is economic rationality, and the way increasingly that takes over the art of government in Western societies, but I have to say, particularly now in other societies as well, from about, I suppose, the 18th century on. Now, it could be argued that traditionally, research, in particular that which came out of universities, was driven by a particular rationality, that of the sovereign state, and of, if you like, making stated subjects of one form or another, good citizens. If you look at early universities and what they thought they were doing, from Humboldt on, much of it is about producing good, stated citizens of one form or another. But it could be argued that this isn't any longer the case. Developments like the impact agenda suggest that in the current period, research is increasingly driven by the rationality of economic agents of one form or another. And although, as Foucault might argue, the rationality of economic agents is but one among many forms that form the art of government, still this rationality has increasingly come to rule the roost. And an extensive quote from Foucault is useful in this regard, I think, because it shows just how far we've come since the 1970s. Political economy, he says, is indeed a science, a type of knowledge, a mode of knowledge which those who govern must take into account. But economic science cannot be the science of government, and economics cannot be the internal principle, law, rule of conduct, or rationality of government. Economics is a science lateral to the cost of governing. One must govern with economics, one must govern alongside economists, one must govern by listening to the economists. But economics must not be, and there is no question it can be, the governmental rationality itself. That comes from someone who's French and who lives in a strong state society. Clearly, Foucault had never met anyone from the British Treasury because I think they might have disabused him of this as a notion. But whatever the case, Foucault argues that in the move to liberal forms of government, the sovereign state basically is stripped of an essential power, that is to master the totality of the economic field. There's another actor which is quasi-independent of it and which it only has very limited control over. Governments require a sovereign space in which authority can be exercised, and this space must of necessity be knowable. Markets by their nature are dynamic, changing, and often unknowable. They change from day to day, and if you ask business people, they will tell you, I don't know what's going to be going on in the next year or so. I'm reacting to the moment a lot of the time. I may have plans and strategies, but they, perforce, will often have to change. And the liberal art of governing, therefore, consists of a balance between a state which is no longer sovereign in the form it used to be, and this constantly changing economy. And for Foucault, this means a new frame of reference is needed in order to enable the art of governing, and he calls this civil society. And he understood civil society to be, if you like, part of the way in which the art of government is made possible, and he absolutely linked it to economics and to the economy in a way that lots of commentators would not. As he put it, Homo economicus and civil society are therefore two inseparable elements. Homo economicus is, if you like, the abstract, ideal, purely economic point that inhabits the dense, full and complex reality of civil society. Or alternatively, civil society is a concrete ensemble within which these ideal points, economic men, must be placed so that they can be appropriately managed. So Homo economicus and civil society belong to the same technology of liberal governmentality. So we can't think of the economy as being one thing and civil society as being another, and as the one being separate from another. Instead, they're part of a co-constituted process in which each limits the other. And this process assumes, if you like, that individuals are constantly, if you like, involved in what Foucault calls spontaneous synthesis. This is the great goal of civil society. It's a process similar to the exchange of rights or the multiplication of profits, but as Foucault says, civil society is much more than the association of different economic subjects. What also must be recognized are what he calls the disinterested interests of civil society: instinct, sentiment, sympathy, benevolence, loathing, repugnance, all these different kinds of everyday affects and the way they work through. This is, if you like, the key difference between the bonds of the civil society and the bonds of economic subjects. And the argument I'm roughly going to make is not only do we have to address the economy, but we do also have to address, at the same time, an irrevocably linked civil society as research institutions. And what this analysis means, I think, is that as researchers, we exist in an era of new liberal forms of knowledge. Traditionally, universities and researchers like to think that they existed in stable sovereign states in which knowledge and information was often thought of as somewhat static and long-term. So you could have canons, you could have curricula, and so on and so forth. But increasingly, these are being attacked not, I think, because of what they represent in certain ways, but because they don't work with the time frame that liberal forms of governmentality actually now work in. And what we're experiencing currently as a result of this multiplication is what Karin Norgetina has recently called the generation of information knowledge. In this context, knowledge is dynamic, it has a shorter shelf life than previously, and it's oriented towards what foraging consumers need rather than what the producers think they need. It's an agent-driven version of events tied to what she calls a mode of living forward. And if you look certainly at the economy, that captures this very well indeed, but actually it also now increasingly captures civil society. If you think of things like the internet and so on through, they're part of this continual swash of movement into the future. And people are trying to get information a lot of the time on the moment itself. But in terms of research value, Foucault's understanding of civil society also illuminates that while economic considerations are one important part of existence, there are other equally important elements. If we look at what binds us together in modern liberal forms of governmentality, in Foucault's view, affects like instinct and sentiment and sympathy are also incredibly important, and research has to inform those as well. Yes, in an environment where that which is valuable must be measurable against some particular economic metric, such as productivity, much important work could potentially fall through the cracks. So, let me come on then to, in this regard, reminding you of the broader definition of impact that the British government itself, in a sense, instituted. Impact understood as that which affects economy, society, culture, public policy and services, health, the environment, international development, quality of life, and so on. In Foucauldian terms, these things actually precisely, in many ways, address exactly things like instinct and sentiment and sympathy. And it's these values I want to highlight in three ways. Because they in particular, I think, inform the social sciences and arts and humanities. It's, of course, much easier to make the case, certainly as a Vice-Chancellor, for the sciences and medicine. The first is to do with what the Arts and Humanities Research Council has called the cultural ecosystem. In terms of arts and humanities research, value is derived from the knowledge, the self-awareness, and the understanding that comes about as a result of rich and deep exploration of the cultural, historical, and social landscape in which we live. This sort of work, which Stefan Collini calls a purposeful expression of human curiosity, is, he writes, an end in itself. But we probably need to say a bit more than that. Some research is an end in itself, since it has to be said to many citizens, this simply sounds self-serving. Even in humanities, there are voices that argue that it's being used basically as a way of promoting a closed shop of increasingly specialized and self-referential debate based on highly esoteric knowledge of one form or another. And it's very interesting, for example, to look at the recent New York Times debate about the humanities. And many of the defenses in that debate simply miss the point, in that they argue that somehow the arts and humanities de facto are a good thing. And whether you like it or not, there are plenty of people out there who have their doubts that that's the case. I commend to you Mark Taylor's recent book, Universities in Crisis, written by a humanities professor, saying we've just got to stop doing some of the things that we're actually doing. That's not to say that arts and humanities research isn't valuable, and there are many ways in which one can index it. The making and recording of memory, for example. We mustn't commit what Tony Jute called the sin of forgetting. It's absolutely crucial to a civilized society, that we understand our history, that we understand where we came from. There's a kind of civilizational aspect, if I can even use that word, to research in the arts and humanities. Empathy and respect. Martha Nussbaum has argued this at length, and so on. The second point I'd like to highlight is the public policy value of much research, particularly in the social sciences and in the arts and humanities. And this is sometimes hard to measure. So it does tell against an impact agenda that seeks to link research with economic productivity. However, there's no doubt that there's huge social and political value to be derived from research that enables us to develop better evidenced, more reliable public policy. And you can think of so many areas in which this is true. Think, for example, of all the work that's being done on aging. Think of all the work that's currently being done on happiness and well-being, which indeed is challenging the whole idea that there is such a thing as GDP, which is easily measured. Think of the whole area of risk in its various forms, and so on and so forth. The list goes on. One thinks of climate change, one thinks of globalization, one thinks of human behavior and choices, one thinks of poverty and social exclusion and disadvantage. Researchers are constantly adding value to these initiatives and producing a discourse that society needs to have. The third point I want to make is to highlight the importance of innovation. Now, I want to do this a bit carefully, because frankly, nowadays, if you put the word innovative in front of anything or creative, it somehow validates it, when of course it does nothing of the kind. Genuine innovation in research is that which combines what is known as beyond the horizon ideas with objectivity rather than simply profit as a key determinant of research undertaken. And while we must acknowledge the importance of links with business and industry for research funding, fundamental or basic research, curiosity-driven research, has to be carried out with different aims to that of the commercial sector. A recent report in the UK acknowledged this, highlighting from that what successful companies really value in R&D terms, at least the best of them, particularly from universities, is the ability of researchers to generate novel ideas, to think at right angles to their R&D staff, and develop expertise from addressing new problems. And this orthogonality is necessary for genuine information. And just a small anecdote to illustrate that. I was once in Boston with a British government minister, and one of the great results of this was that 8 of the senior CEOs of American business came one by one in front of us and were asked by the minister about what they thought about research in the Boston area and what they wanted from it. And I think he was surprised. Every single one of them said, "We want basic research." Basic research. That's what counts for us, because we will do a lot of the time the application, but we need the ideas. That's not to say at the same time that innovation can't also come about through applied research. Tinkering, and I'm not using that word pejoratively, with established processes and products to make them more efficient, more effective, or just different, is an extraordinarily important activity in which universities are also involved, and quite rightly too. And my own university's got quite a good example of this in the form of the Warwick Manufacturing Group, which has been around now for 30 years, and has worked constantly with companies improving their products and processes. Indeed, to the point where recently 170 of Jaguar Land Rover's employees have moved onto the campus. And we are going to have a full applied research capacity to allow us to work in the advanced automotive sphere, which is a good place for universities to be. It might also be said, and I'm not saying this cynically, that having these kinds of activity acts actually to demonstrate worth, and it gives a kind of bastion for those people who are doing basic research to actually shelter behind. You can always point to these activities at any time, so it is exceptionally dangerous to try to demean them. Innovative research may well ultimately result in economic value, but it's difficult to know how much. And of course, there are now numerous indexes trying precisely to measure innovation and innovative capacity. I'm cynical about most of them, but they have something to say at the same point. So there are many ways in which we can think of research value, and what I thought I'd do is end by thinking about these. Some of them are amenable to being quantified, some of them aren't. As a Vice-Chancellor of a research-intensive university, I'm very sympathetic to arguments about the traditional roles of universities. I've argued elsewhere about the role that universities have, the value of the making of memory I've mentioned, but other values, cosmopolitanism, the development of conscience, seriousness, even wonder. Much of science, in the end, is precisely about developing wonder in the natural world, one way or the other. And some of the scientific innovations that have been going on recently, for example, in astrophysics, in quantum physics and such like, are quite frankly mind-boggling. And this is just wonderful, and it almost, in a sense, straight off, so far as I'm concerned, validates universities. But also, I think we have to be very careful to try and say that that works in the wider world. We also, I think, need to make sure that the research we're doing is valued in that wider world if we're ever to keep the kind of constituency that supports universities. We're working, as I said, in a world which often values information knowledge over long-term knowledge, in which universities, which were run in terms of sovereignty and state and subject, now exist in an era of economy and civil society. And I'm concerned that as a result, researchers in receipt of public funding will increasingly have to be able to answer questions about what exactly their value to the taxpayer is, exactly what that value is. Indeed, this is already happening. I mentioned at a talk yesterday a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, which discussed a new scheme at Texas A&M University in which the profit and loss balance sheets of individual faculty members were publicly available across the university, whether in the red or in the black in terms of what they were doing. In this situation, of course, there are all kinds of options we might think about. Let me just mention two out of many which may allow us to defend basic research, which we know to be important, but which is being eroded to some extent. One of these is for researchers to pursue research in institutions that are drastically smaller. There is, I think, a case for saying that for the arts and humanities, and maybe for the social sciences, one way to go would actually be to produce much smaller institutions which are specialised, in which it becomes actually, I think, easier to do basic research of one form or another. I'm thinking here of the American liberal arts model. And it's worth remembering who charges the highest fees in the United States. It's liberal arts colleges. And they're able to do that, and as a result of that, they're also able to carry on with very interesting arts and humanities research. But we can go the other way. We don't have to go little, we can also go large. And the other option, I think, is a much larger one, which is for like-minded universities and research institutions to amalgamate. And I think one of the things that is going to be happening over the next few years is there will be, if you like, worldwide merger and concentration of universities. And that scale will also protect basic research. Of course, research networks and alliances, but people are now talking about things like holding company mergers as well. As ways in which one can produce really large research organizations. In the sciences, I think this will be key. Anyone who works in science knows that the cost of some equipment now and the difficulty of actually renewing it every 3 or 5 years means the only way you can do things is to concentrate resources. Having said that, whichever option is pursued, there's one thing we can't get away from. Universities and research institutes are going to have to generate more diverse sources of income. And in all sorts of ways, of that I have no doubt. They have to understand, I think, that increasingly the game will not be chasing state funding only. It will be chasing very large and different sources of income of one kind or another. And as a result of this, I think what's going to happen over the next 20 to 25 years is that the university will be reinvented. And that will enable those core values to be reasserted, though in different ways. And already you can start to see this happening. Look, for example, at some of the thinking that's going on in the United States at the moment, which is extraordinarily interesting. Think, for example, of Luana Simon's work on what she calls the Global Grant University, the follow-up to the Land Grant University. Think of John Sexton, the head of NYU, and his work on a global network university. NYU, I think, has 16, 18 campuses at the moment. Indeed, there was a wonderful spoof on the web recently, NYU opening campus in Antarctica. And a whole series of people believed it, it has to be said. So there are whole sorts of things of that kind going on, and the university will be reinvented as a result of this. And I think that is very interesting and in many ways very exciting, and it is all about connectivity, which is one of the themes of precisely this conference. So I'm going over time. I'm going to conclude. I hope I provided food for thought in terms of how we think about the value of research. I believe it's important to be open to new possibilities in this debate, primarily because I don't think we have another option. To put it more optimistically, as researchers, we're expected to be creative and original in our own work. Now's the time for applying that creativity and originality to other things. One, to the sustainability of universities themselves. The university is there to be defended at this point in time. Secondly, to making the case for more investment in research and development. And I'm going to digress here. Some of you will have seen Fareed Zakaria's recent influential article, highly influential article in Time, arguing that the US needed to invest 6% of its GDP in research and development as a national survival strategy. 6%. Think of the UK and where it is. Think of New Zealand and where it is. If everyone moved to 6%, this would be an extraordinary thing to see happening. And then lastly, and I'm not diminishing this at all, in reaffirming the simple joy, the joy of doing research. Research is, as the saying goes, serious fun. And all this reconstruction must be to allow, in a sense, that very serious fun to actually continue. So to theme the talk, run hot, what you're doing as researchers is absolutely vital to the world. Thank you.